Hey everyone, welcome back to Term 1 History. So today we're going to be looking at the earliest inhabitants of the Caribbean region. So we're going to look into who they were, why they came, and where they settled. Now, the first thing we need to know is that these early inhabitants, they came from Asia to the Americas, or what we know today as the Caribbean region. Now, in those days, in very ancient times, the Caribbean region was not always the Caribbean or the West Indies or the tropics. It was merely known as the Americas, not the America, the Americas, because at that time, the Europeans, Asians, and the early settlers, they saw these nice islands. They saw them having different amenities that could satisfy their needs. However, they didn't have appropriate names for them at the time. So they used one collective word, the Americas. Now, migration from Asia to the Americas was made possible by means of a land and ice bridge known as the Bering Strait. Now, there are different theories to what this bridge might have been made from, whether it was strictly land, whether it was 50% land, 50% ice, or completely ice. However, majority of history records help us to see that this bridge was indeed both land and ice. Now, why were these Asians traveling to the Americas? Now, this migration took place mainly because they were following mammoths, herds of cattle, of which they depended on for their ultimate survival. Survival meaning they depended on the meat from these animals for food, they depended on their bones for shelter to build their homes, they depended on their fur and their skin for clothing. So they weren't trying to discover new lands, they weren't trying to escape enemies, they were merely following different animals that they depended on for their ultimate survival. Now, this entire migration took place during the 4th Ice Age. So the migration from Asia to the Americas via the Bering Strait took place in the 4th Ice Age. Now, when they first settled within the Caribbean or in the Americas, some of them settled in the east, which was extremely cold, while some of them gravitated to the western areas, which had a lot of warm temperatures. Now, these western areas were really places such as Hispaniola and Jamaica. Now, let's fast forward a little bit from these ancient settlers to what we know today, their descendants, the Tenors. Now, the Tenors first came to the Caribbean by first settling in Trinidad. Now, they were a very large group, however, they were very subsistent in their lifestyle. So they lived in villages, they carved wood, they made pottery, they wove cotton, they practiced religion based on respect for nature and ancestors, and they believed in many gods, which means that their religion was based on polytheism. Now, being that they worshipped nature and their ancestors, you can tell that they were very superstitious in their beliefs. They were very simple people. The economic activities that they took place, as I stated, was very subsistent. Now, what does subsistent mean? Being subsistent means that they provided mainly for themselves and their families with little or no surplus. This did not provide opportunities for trade or an expansion of exporting and importing goods and services. They stuck to mainly supplying and providing for their families. Now, they spoke the language Arawakan, and this led to them being known as the Arawaks. So the name Arawaks is not a name that they had given themselves, it was one that was labeled for them because of the language that they spoke. The name that they chose was actually the Amerindians or the Tenors. So the Tenors, they mainly settled in the Greater Antilles, of course, countries such as Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. And this is because they needed a lot of land space to satisfy their population size. Now, they also wanted room to hunt and to farm. They were excellent farmers and they were great at agriculture. They needed a far greater scope for development overall for their entire economy, and so the Greater Antilles satisfied this need for them. Now, whenever they settled in the Greater Antilles, they really stuck to the different coastlines because that way they could have easy access to water. They were able to trade with other Tenors that settled on the coastlines of other countries because it was very easy. And even though they didn't have very advanced skills in making canoes, they were able to make what was suitable for them to carry out small trade. Now, settling on the coastline also had the benefit of them being able to see their approaching enemies. Now, as we learn further into the different indigenous groups, we're going to learn about the Caribs and how they often raided the Tenor villages for women and their children and their different items. Now, the Tenors, they hunted and grew just enough what they needed to satisfy their families. Their communities were fairly small, especially because they lived in villages. Now, as far as their political organization is concerned, they had the cacique as the head of their entire society, and below him were lesser chiefs known as Tenors. Now, the labor force that was oversaw was actually the Nabarios. Now, the Nabarios would be the regular peasant Tenors. They weren't necessarily slaves, but they were those who had to work. They had to work in agriculture. They had to do exactly what the chiefs and the commander-in-chief dictated. The cacique was a hereditary position which was passed from father to son. In very rare circumstances, such as in Hispaniola, women were allowed to be the cacique. Now, in the event that the father has passed and he has no sons, it will pass to his eldest brother. In the event that he has no brothers, it would pass to his sisters, his eldest sister's eldest son, and so on. So they really tried for the position to go on to a male. However, in the event that this man, the father, had a son, cacique has passed, it goes to his son. However, the persons within the village disagree with this, or the Tenors, those are the lesser chiefs. They do not believe that this person is worthy, or they don't believe that he is qualified to be the cacique. It's easy for them to appoint someone else. Now, this is a diagram of what a typical Tenor village would look like. As you can see, they lived in small huts known as canais. It was made out of wattle and daub and straw. It wasn't anything too fancy. And from what you can see here, a lot of the Tenors, they went either naked or they wore very little clothing. However, when it came on to the women wore skirts, what we know today as pencil skirts, and where the cacique's wife is concerned, she was required to wear the longest skirt. Now, the next indigenous group is that of the Caribs. The Caribs were very aggressive. In comparison to the Tenors, they would raid their villages regularly, but they settled mainly in the Lesser Antilles. Now, the difference between the Caribs and the Tenors was that the Caribs, they were mainly hunters. So they weren't the type to sit or to invest time into planting and growing and really any form of agricultural practice. They didn't have the time, nor did they have the patience. They were warriors they were warriors genetically. So they believed in constantly training and preparing for war. Now, the Lesser Antilles lended itself to their preparation in warrior training, as it had a rigid terrain, and this rigid terrain helped them become better hunters and also prepare for battle. Now, the Caribs' diet contained a greater amount of protein than that of the Tenors, mainly because of the hunting, but aside from this, it was very much the same. So they were also better fishermen. They had a lot of large canoes, and these canoes are made of excellent quality. They too were very superstitious, and their superstitions influenced their diet. So before they would go on a voyage or go on a trade and they had to use their canoes, they would never eat crab because they thought that eating crab prior to this voyage would result in a storm. They didn't believe in eating turtles, as they thought that turtles would make them very slow and ill-equipped for battle. They thought that eating pork would give them beady eyes as the pig and make them unprepared for war. So they seasoned their food with pepper and not with salt, because they believed that the pepper would give them energy, it would give them the strength that they need to bear pain, whereas the salt would really slow them down. Now, the Caribs, their political organization held strictly in the hands of the Tibulte Hod. This is the village headman. So he appointed lesser men known as the Ubutus, who represented commander-in-chiefs. Now, if a raid was successful, the Ubuntu was able to keep his title for life. However, if he wasn't successful, he would not only lose his title, but also his life. Now, Carib men would live together in a large building or a large hut known as a carbe. In the Caribbean, they would plan very important meetings to plan a raid. They would plan meetings on initiation ceremonies, as in younger Caribbean boys trying to become men. They would carry out warrior training at these Caribs and so forth. So at the age of 4, young Carib boys were taken from their mothers to live in the Caribbean and be trained by the older Carib men within the society. This was because it was believed that once the boy was left with his mother beyond the age of 4, she would smother him, she would make him a bit more feminine in behavior, and so before that influence could take over, the men decided to adopt the boys from the age of 4. Now, like the Tenors, the Kalinagos also practiced ancestor and nature worship and also believed in many gods and goddesses. And here's a diagram of the Caribs. They were very fierce persons, so they didn't believe in wearing clothes, as you can see, and they were excellent in hunting. They used bows and arrows, and oftentimes in war, what they would do, they would use the poisonous liquid obtained from cassava to wet the tip of the arrow so that when they shoot it to their enemies, it would kill them immediately. Now, this is all the information that you have to know on both the Caribs and the Tenors. In our next class, we'll look more into a more advanced type of Amerindian, and that would be the Mayans.